When German soldiers were captured and sent into captivity in America, they did not arrive as blank slates. Their minds carried the weight of years of carefully crafted propaganda. From the earliest days of the Nazi regime, America had been painted as a country of soft men, driven by greed, weakened by materialism, and broken by racial diversity. German newspapers and radio repeated these themes endlessly, insisting that the United States lacked the discipline and unity required to fight a total war. To them, Americans were nothing more than consumers of jazz, chewing gum, and frivolous products, a people too addicted to comfort to withstand hardship. For officers and enlisted men alike, this belief created a powerful sense of superiority. They told each other stories about how quickly America would crumble once its cities were bombed, or its soldiers forced into combat against hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht. The image they carried into battle was not of a determined industrial giant, but of a distracted, divided society already collapsing under its own contradictions. When the war spread across Europe, many Germans were convinced that their victory was assured before America had even entered the fight. This mindset was not limited to the high command. Ordinary soldiers, even those who had never left their small towns, repeated the same lines with confidence. America was rich but weak, loud but shallow, armed with machines but lacking the steel of character. In their minds, it was the disciplined German soldier, not the pampered American, who represented true strength. So when capture finally came, these men boarded the trains believing they were being sent to the land of an enemy both wealthy and incompetent, an enemy incapable of discipline. What they were about to discover would not only shock them, but unravel everything they thought they knew. The German soldiers' confidence did not come out of thin air. It was forged in the crucible of early victories that seemed to confirm every boast their leaders made. France, which many thought would hold out for years as it had during the First World War, collapsed in a matter of weeks. The speed of the blitzkrieg across the Low Countries and into Paris left German troops convinced that no army could resist their momentum. Officers wrote home about how disciplined planning and superior command had swept aside the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, fueling a sense that German might was unstoppable. From there, triumphs continued. In the Balkans, campaigns that might have bogged down others were executed with brutal efficiency. Greece and Yugoslavia fell swiftly, reinforcing the belief that German organization and determination could overcome any obstacle. Each victory layered confidence upon confidence, convincing both officers and enlisted men that destiny itself favored them. North Africa added another chapter to this growing pride. Though resources were limited, German soldiers watched Rommel's Afrika Korps outmaneuver larger British forces. Tales of tank battles across the desert, of bold maneuvers and daring raids, spread quickly through the ranks. These stories painted an image of the German soldier as a master of any battlefield, adaptable, resourceful, and always superior to his opponent. By the time many of these men found themselves facing capture, they carried within them the memory of one dazzling victory after another. To them, America seemed like just another opponent waiting to be humbled. Their confidence soared, unbroken, even as the tides of war slowly began to turn. When capture finally came, most German soldiers braced themselves for the worst. Propaganda had painted vivid images of enemy brutality, warning them that Allied treatment would be cruel and degrading. They expected hunger, harsh guards, and long marches under guard dogs and rifle butts. Yet from the very first steps into captivity, reality delivered a shock that unsettled their expectations. The train that carried them deeper into Allied territory was nothing like the cattle cars they themselves had used to transport prisoners. Instead of splintered wooden benches or straw on the floor, they found padded seats and clean compartments. The contrast was so stark that many assumed at first it was some kind of mistake, or a trick meant to soften them up before harsher conditions arrived. When the doors closed and the train rumbled forward, the sense of confusion only deepened. To their astonishment, the car even included a dining section. Uniformed staff served simple meals of bread, cheese, and hot drinks. Food presented not as scraps thrown to captives, but as orderly service. Some men whispered in disbelief that American soldiers traveling the same rails might be eating identical meals, sitting in cars no different than those given to prisoners. The dignity of it unsettled them more than threats ever could. They sat in silence, the steady rhythm of the train amplifying the strangeness of the moment. Here they were, defeated men, being treated with a level of civility they would not have granted their own enemy. The journey to captivity was supposed to be humiliating, but instead it became their first glimpse of a world that contradicted everything they had been told. As the train carried them further inland, the prisoners pressed their faces against the window. Night had fallen, and with it came the sight that left them whispering in disbelief. Town after town glowed against the darkness, streets bathed in electric light, houses with windows shining warmly, shop signs burning brightly as if war had never reached this place. For men accustomed to the suffocating blackouts of Germany, where every candle was watched and every window was shrouded in thick curtains, the scene was almost unreal. They remembered their own cities cloaked in darkness, waiting for the drone of bombers. Families stumbled through streets lit only by dim lanterns, factories reduced to shadows while workers struggled by touch. In Germany, light meant danger. To see it so freely on display here was a direct assault on everything they thought they understood about the balance of power. Some POWs muttered that it was impossible. Perhaps the Allies had staged these glowing towns to impress them. But the further the train rolled, the more undeniable the evidence became. Village after village, city after city, all ablaze with the kind of energy Germany could no longer dream of. Children played outside well past sundown, neon signs flickered above diners, headlights streamed down roads clogged with civilian cars. It was not propaganda, it was simply life. For the Germans staring out from behind glass, the glow of America was more than light, it was proof that their homeland, rationed and starved, was fighting a nation that had energy to spare, a society so secure it could afford to waste electricity on shop fronts and glowing signs. The disbelief lingered like a weight in their chest. The war, they realized, was being fought between two entirely different worlds. When the prisoners first heard the numbers, they thought it was a lie. No shipyard in the world, they insisted, could construct an ocean-going vessel in less than a year, let alone in days. But standing at the edge of an American dockyard, they were forced to confront a truth that rattled them to the core. Before their eyes, an entire Liberty ship, a massive steel cargo vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic, rose from skeleton to seaworthy in less than a week. The sheer pace defied every instinct shaped by German industry. In the Reich, each warship had been a monument, consuming months or years of labor, precision engineering and endless resource. Yet here in America, production was treated not as a craft but as a rhythm, like the steady beat of a drum that never faltered. Components rolled in by train, cranes swung steel plates into position, welding sparks flew across shifts that never seemed to end. Men and women in overalls moved with practiced efficiency, every motion tuned to the goal of speed. The POWs whispered among themselves, days, they repeated in disbelief. How could this be possible? How could workers with so many women, even teenagers, deliver something their proudest shipyards could not? The numbers spread quickly, a ship every 4 days, hundreds each year. To the Germans it was not just impressive, it was terrifying. It meant that no matter how many vessels they sank, more would rise almost instantly to replace them. In that moment the prisoners understood that America's strength was not merely in its weapons, but in the speed with which it could create them. For the first time many of them felt a stunned realization settle over their pride. They were fighting not just an enemy, but a machine of production unlike anything the world had ever seen. If the Liberty ships themselves left the German prisoners speechless, the scale of the ports that launched them reduced them to silence. Towering cranes swung effortlessly over vast docks, each capable of lifting loads that would have required entire teams of men back home. The POWs stood in line as far as the eye could see, watching steel containers, timber and machinery move in a steady flow, the rhythm of an empire that seemed to breathe industry. They were used to the cramped shipyards of Hamburg or Kiel, where shortages slowed every step and every delivery was rationed. But here in New Orleans, Norfolk or New York, the sheer abundance was overwhelming. Rail lines stretched into the horizon, delivering coal, steel and fuel without pause. Forklifts hummed across the docks, stacking crates with practiced precision. Supply trains pulled in on one side as convoys of trucks rolled out the other, feeding an endless cycle that never seemed to stop. Some prisoners whispered that it felt less like a harbor and more like a living organism. Every crane, every worker, every train car pulsed in unison, all serving a single purpose: war production. The Germans compared it to their own strained networks, where a single bombing raid could sever supply for weeks. Here redundancy was everywhere. If one track broke, another took its place. If one crane jammed, two more kept moving. The enormity of it filled the prisoners not just with awe, but with a creeping curiosity. How could any nation hope to outlast such machinery of supply? For the first time they wondered whether the war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in these humming ports of steel and smoke. The first time German POWs were handed American cigarettes, disbelief rippled through the lines. For men accustomed to rationing, scarcity, and strict control over every luxury, this was unthinkable. Back home, cigarettes were tightly regulated, expensive, and often shared sparingly. Here in the open mess halls of Mississippi, Texas, and Arizona, they were offered freely, dozens at a time, as though they were as common as bread. Some of the prisoners held them in their hands, turning them over, almost afraid to light them. They marveled at the smooth tobacco, the uniform packaging, the sheer ease with which they could now indulge. American guards and Red Cross volunteers simply smiled, offering more, expecting nothing in return. One POW whispered to his friend, "Are they really giving this to us?" The other nodded, eyes wide, barely able to comprehend the generosity. It wasn't just the cigarettes themselves, it was the context. These were the same people they had been told were decadent, weak, and incapable of discipline. Yet here they were, providing freely, without restriction, without expectation of repayment. Every puff they took felt surreal, a tangible contradiction to the propaganda drilled into them for years. The effect was immediate. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads, and a few quietly wept. It was more than a luxury, it was a statement, a quiet demonstration of abundance and security. In that moment, the POWs began to see America not as a country to be underestimated, but as a nation with unimaginable resources and confidence. For many, that first pack of cigarettes was the opening crack in the armor of their indoctrination, a small but undeniable glimpse of a world where abundance wasn't feared, it was shared. As the POWs settled into camp life, the contrast between America's abundance and Germany's scarcity became painfully clear. Back home, each cigarette, each chocolate bar, each rationed item was calculated and precious. Bread was hard-won, meat reserved for special occasions, and sugar a rare treat. Here in the United States, nothing felt rare. Meals were plentiful, snacks were abundant, and cigarettes were handed out with a casual generosity that left the prisoners speechless. They watched American soldiers light their own cigarettes without a second thought, while they themselves had once hoarded a single pack for days. Even the simplest luxuries, the small daily items that German civilians had long considered precious, seemed ordinary in America. POWs began comparing notes quietly, sharing stories of how difficult it had been to acquire such things back home. A simple chocolate bar here, a cigarette there. Each instance was a small shock, a reminder that the world they had believed in was not the only reality. The prisoners' reactions were mixed. Some felt exhilaration, the thrill of abundance washing over them like an impossible dream. Others felt guilt, the weight of knowing their families at home suffered shortages they themselves had been spared. And yet envy and admiration blended in equal measure. They marveled not just at the availability of goods, but at the scale of organization that made such abundance possible. Warehouses stacked high with supplies, endless shipments arriving daily, and the sight of everyday Americans living comfortably, all of it challenged their preconceptions. This abundance was not only material, it was symbolic. America's ability to provide freely even to enemy soldiers showcased a confidence and security that the POWs could scarcely comprehend. Every cigarette, every snack, every small indulgence became evidence of a nation whose strength was measured not by scarcity or fear, but by generosity and industrial might. In the POW camps, the unexpected abundance of American cigarettes transformed them into a currency of their own. For prisoners who had once lived under strict rationing, the sight of endless packs of cigarettes distributed freely was astonishing. Before long, these small paper-wrapped items assumed a value far beyond mere leisure. They became tokens of power, bargaining chips in a miniature economy. A single cigarette could secure extra food, a favor from a fellow prisoner, or even access to a coveted bunk closer to warmth. The prisoners observed the social dynamics unfold with fascination. Cigarettes facilitated transactions that mimicked financial exchanges, yet carried a personal and immediate significance. Bartering became the language of the camp. A soldier might trade 2 cigarettes for an extra portion of stew or offer a pack in exchange for help with laundry or cleaning duties. The simplicity of this system highlighted the contrast with the rigid, controlled environments they had known in Germany. Here, scarcity was replaced by choice, and personal initiative determined success within the camp's microcosm. The psychological impact was profound. POWs began to reassess the value of material wealth and its relationship to personal freedom. In Germany, currency had little meaning when goods were scarce, and rationing was enforced by fear. In America, the same items became symbols of abundance, a tangible reminder that wealth could be created, distributed, and enjoyed without coercion. Cigarettes, mundane in the eyes of American guards, became a medium for empowerment and social leverage among the prisoners. This new economy also fostered a sense of community. Trade required negotiation, observation, and prisoners learned to read each other's habits and intentions, developing a nuanced understanding of social interaction under novel circumstances. Small as it seemed, the circulation of cigarettes reshaped the camp's daily life, giving the POWs insight into a society where resources were plentiful and cooperation was possible. Through these simple acts of exchange, the men glimpsed a world where abundance was the norm, not the exception, a world starkly different from the one they had left behind. Beyond mere currency, cigarettes quickly became a social lubricant within the POW camp. Prisoners discovered that offering a cigarette could smooth tensions, win favors, or even spark new friendships. A single pack might allow a man to secure an extra portion of soup, a small treat like chocolate, or assistance with a task that would otherwise be laborious. The exchange of cigarettes evolved into a subtle art of negotiation, teaching prisoners to read moods, gauge willingness, and establish trust among one another. This dynamic created surprising bonds. Soldiers who might have been distant or competitive in their former units now cooperated, sharing insights and helping one another in exchange for these small tokens. Cigarettes became a bridge across language gaps and regional differences, fostering camaraderie and a sense of community. The men learned that even under captivity, social capital mattered, and that generosity could earn loyalty and gratitude in return. For the audience, this detail humanizes the POW experience. It illustrates that even in harsh conditions, ordinary objects, when abundant, can transform relationships and morale. Cigarettes, mundane in American daily life, became symbols of agency, opportunity, and human connection for the prisoner. The psychological effect was unexpected. The POWs realized that value wasn't fixed by state decree or ideology. Instead, it emerged from scarcity, necessity, and the choices people made within those constraints. Every cigarette traded or gifted carried meaning, embedding lessons about trust, reciprocity, and the human capacity to adapt and find community, even in a place defined by confinement and surveillance. As the German POWs began to settle into the routines of American camp life, they couldn't help but notice the small details of everyday abundance surrounding them. Outside the factory gates and along the streets they walked, cars gleamed under the sunlight, polished and powerful. They observed workers arriving in tidy boots, carrying neatly packed lunches, some with fresh bread, fruit, and even sandwiches layered with cold cuts. These were ordinary men and women, teachers, clerks, laborers, yet their possessions and daily comforts seemed to the prisoners like treasure. For soldiers accustomed to rationed meals, worn-out shoes, and scarcity, the sight was disorienting. A loaf of bread, a pair of durable boots, a clean lunchbox. These were items German citizens often went without for months, yet here in a country they had been taught to dismiss as decadent and weak, they were commonplace. Even the casual confidence of Americans as they walked, chatted, and laughed in the streets struck the POWs. Everything about daily life radiated security and prosperity. This stark contrast did more than provoke envy, it created wonder. The POWs began to understand, viscerally, the power of a system that allowed ordinary citizens to thrive while they in Germany had suffered from shortages and propaganda. The simple fact that so many people could live comfortably, without apparent fear, left an indelible impression. For the audience, this section transforms abstract ideas about wealth and democracy into tangible, relatable experiences. Viewers see through the prisoner's eyes,
How ordinary abundance can astonish those who have lived under constant deprivation. Each car, boot, and lunch becomes a symbol of what prosperity looks like when it is accessible to all, not just the elite. A quiet but powerful testament to societal strength and human resilience.
As the weeks in captivity passed, the POWs' initial shock at America's abundance deepened into a more unsettling realization. It was not just the material comforts that amazed them, but the fact that these comforts were enjoyed by ordinary citizens. The teachers, the clerks, the factory workers, not by the privileged elite. In Germany, the soldiers had grown up seeing wealth and high-quality living reserved for the aristocracy, military officers, or party officials. But here in America, the middle-class worker drove a reliable car, wore sturdy boots, and ate hearty meals without pretense or limitation. This revelation struck at the very core of the German worldview. The POWs began to grasp that in a democratic society, prosperity was not hoarded by the powerful. It was a shared benefit, accessible to those who worked diligently and contributed to society. The realization created a quiet, almost disbelieving respect. These Americans had not only built a system of industrial efficiency, but also created a society that allowed ordinary individuals to live better than the elite in Germany had ever done. For the audience, this moment crystallizes the hidden strength of democracy. Through the prisoner's eyes, viewers perceive that power is not merely military or political. It can reside in the everyday lives of citizens who are free, productive, and treated with dignity. The shock of seeing ordinary Americans live with comfort and security becomes a moral and intellectual hook, prompting reflection on the values of equality, human rights, and societal design. This contrast between expectation and reality deepens engagement, as viewers vicariously experience the POW's awe and gradually recognize the transformative power of freedom and democracy. What initially seemed ordinary, the car, the boot, the lunchbox, emerges as a quiet testament to the strength of a society that empowers its people, not crushes them. As the POWs were escorted through the sprawling industrial complexes, their eyes widened with disbelief. They had been taught that only the strongest, most disciplined men could run a factory efficiently, that women and people of color were incapable of operating complex machinery or maintaining production standards. Yet before them, these very groups moved with skill, confidence, and precision. Women in overalls adjusted massive gears, monitored gauges, and welded steel components with a level of expertise that would have impressed any veteran officer. African-American workers operated cranes and drove forklifts, seamlessly integrating into production lines that churned out thousands of parts each day. Teenagers handled intricate drilling machinery, their small hands moving faster and more accurately than the POWs had ever imagined. The German soldiers could not reconcile this reality with the ideology drilled into them from childhood. In Nazi propaganda, only Aryan men were capable of sustaining a nation's industrial might. The success of others was either dismissed or erased entirely. But here, in the heart of America's industrial engine, the POWs saw undeniable proof of equality in action. Productivity did not falter because of gender or race, it thrived. Every shift, every assembly, and every finished component served as evidence that their beliefs about racial and gender superiority were fundamentally flawed. For viewers, this moment is more than historical observation. It becomes a jarring lens through which the fragility of propaganda is revealed. The audience experiences the POW's growing ideological conflict, witnessing firsthand how deeply ingrained myths can crumble when confronted by stark reality. Curiosity spikes as viewers begin to imagine themselves in the prisoner's shoes, forced to question everything they had assumed about human capability and societal organization. This section creates a powerful emotional anchor, combining awe and disbelief with moral tension. It demonstrates that dismantling falsehoods is not always achieved through argument but often through exposure to truth. In America's factories, the POWs learned a lesson their prior education could not have taught: efficiency, skill, and dedication know no gender or racial boundaries, and ideological myths collapse when faced with evidence. The POWs were led deeper into the factories, and what they saw made even their seasoned military minds reel. Entire complexes stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with assembly lines, cranes, and conveyor belts working in perfect harmony. One building alone produced more components in a single month than entire German regions could manage in a year. The scale was almost incomprehensible, Steel, machinery, and manpower flowed seamlessly together, creating a rhythm that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying in its efficiency. The soldiers compared what they were witnessing with the factory towns back home. In Germany, production had been painstakingly slow, disrupted by shortages, and constantly affected by the war's shifting fortunes. Here in America, the workforce never faltered. 3 shifts ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Women, men, teenagers, and minority workers collaborated flawlessly, their combined effort producing an industrial output that defied everything the POWs had been taught about efficiency and capability. Every crate moved, every rivet placed, every hull welded served as evidence that America's industrial might was both vast and unstoppable. For viewers, this scene delivers cinematic awe. The audience feels dwarfed by the sheer magnitude of the operations, sharing in the prisoners' stunned disbelief. Curiosity and tension rise as they try to process numbers, speed, and coordination that seem impossible. The contrast between Nazi Germany's limited production and the United States' overwhelming capacity becomes almost visceral, driving home the lesson that propaganda can never compete with raw capability and organizational mastery. In this moment, the POWs confront a truth they cannot deny. The war was not merely a clash of armies but a contest of production efficiency and scale, and America had already won that battle in ways no propaganda could prepare them for. The prisoners walked into the mess hall, expecting the usual rationed portions that had marked their lives in Germany, bread so hard it threatened their teeth, thin soup barely warm, and scraps stretched over weeks. Instead, they were confronted with mountains of food. Loaves of bread were stacked like bricks, jugs of milk gleamed on counters, and slabs of meat were everywhere, untouched and unguarded. What shocked them even more were the cigarettes casually thrown across tables, piles of them waiting for anyone to take. Some soldiers instinctively reached for the nearest packet, then froze, realizing that here in America these items were given freely, not rationed, not earned through black market cunning, simply offered. For the POWs it was more than abundance, it was humiliation. Their entire understanding of scarcity and value was upended. The ease with which Americans discarded what Germans had fought to obtain daily made the prisoners feel small, powerless, and ashamed. Their years of indoctrination that they were the disciplined, superior race crashed against the reality of generosity and overabundance. For viewers, this scene delivers a gut-level emotional punch. The contrast between deprivation and casual wealth evokes empathy, awe, and tension simultaneously. The audience feels the prisoners' confusion, disbelief, and growing shame. Every discarded loaf, every freely offered cigarette becomes a symbol of a world they cannot comprehend, a stark, humanizing lesson in humility and morality. In witnessing these acts, the POWs' rigid mental armor begins to crack. The ideological superiority they carried into captivity is shaken, replaced by a dawning recognition the enemy they had been taught to despise not only possesses resources beyond imagination, but exercises power with humanity, kindness, and generosity. For the first time they confront a truth more compelling than any propaganda, the moral and practical strength of a society built on abundance and empathy. As winter approached, the camp transformed in unexpected ways. For the first time the prisoners experienced something beyond rations and labor, gestures of human kindness. On Christmas morning, tables were set with an array of foods unimaginable to men who had spent years under deprivation. Turkey, ham, vegetables, pies, and even ice cream were laid out in abundance. The aromas themselves seemed foreign, teasing the senses of men who had never dreamed of such plenty. Beyond the meals, it was the small acts of generosity from the local community that left the deepest impression. Families visited the camp to deliver hand-baked cookies, children sang carols in the camp courtyard, and letters from American civilians expressing goodwill were distributed. Prisoners who had arrived with fear and suspicion were met with smiles, warmth, and genuine hospitality. Every encounter became a lesson in empathy. Guards paused to share a story, local volunteers showed patience and courtesy, and even simple gestures, an extra helping, a warm blanket, a handshake, imbued the environment with dignity. For viewers, this section evokes an emotional warmth that contrasts with the previous shock of abundance. The audience can feel the redemption spark in the prisoners' hearts, witnessing them slowly reconcile awe with gratitude. It humanizes the narrative, showing that even amid captivity, gestures of kindness can transform perception, nurture trust, and ignite hope. The effect on the POWs was profound. Men who had been trained to see the world through the lens of fear and propaganda began to recognize humanity in the enemy. The experience of sharing a meal, the simple joy of carols, and the care shown by Americans challenged years of indoctrination. For the first time they glimpsed a world where power could coexist with compassion, where strength did not require cruelty. It was a quiet yet powerful redemption, one that planted seeds of understanding, respect, and a new moral awareness in hearts once hardened by war. In early June, news of the Normandy invasion reached the camp, but it could not prepare the prisoners for the reality they were about to witness. Large screens were set up in the camp theater, and footage from the beaches and skies of France played for all to see. Row after row of ships stretched across the horizon, their hulls carrying troops, tanks, and supplies in an unending stream. Aircraft roared above, dropping paratroopers and supplies, while beaches teemed with the first waves of Allied soldiers. The scale was staggering, a living testament to coordination, logistics, and industrial power far beyond anything the prisoners had imagined. The men who had once believed in German invincibility felt their confidence crumble. Every frame revealed a reality that defied the stories they had been told: planes that could not be shot down easily, landing craft that seemed to multiply as if by magic, and a seamless flow of men and material that Germany could never match. The POW's eyes followed convoys of trucks moving relentlessly, supply chains in perfect synchronization, and soldiers moving with precision across chaos. It was cinematic in scope, almost surreal in execution. For the audience, this section is designed to evoke cinematic awe. They can sense the magnitude of the Allied operation, feel the psychological collapse of men who believed in racial and military superiority, and understand how overwhelming force can be conveyed without words, simply through scale and execution. The prisoners' reactions, jaw-dropped, hands gripping seats, whispered disbelief, mirror the audience's own astonishment. By the time the footage ended, the men in the theater were silent. The myth of invincible Germany had been shattered not by propaganda or argument, but by the undeniable visual evidence of Allied might. For viewers, the impact is both thrilling and sobering: awe at human organization or genius, and a recognition of how ideology can be dismantled by witnessing reality. For the POWs, it was the moment they truly understood that the war was not merely lost on the battlefield, it was being redefined by a power they had underestimated at every turn. After the awe of the Normandy invasion, another set of images was shown, this time of a far darker, more painful reality. The prisoners were confronted with footage and photographs of concentration camps across Germany and occupied territory. Rows upon rows of barracks, emaciated prisoners, and guards enforcing harsh routines appeared on screen. The camera lingered on skeletal faces, hollow eyes staring back at the viewer, a stark reminder of the human cost of the ideology they had once served. For the German POWs, the shock was immediate. They had been trained to see the world through a lens of superiority and propaganda, yet here was the undeniable evidence of what their regime had inflicted on countless innocent lives. Every photograph, every frame, drove home the stark contrast between the imagined glory of the Third Reich and the horrifying reality of its crime. The men whispered among themselves, some unable to speak, others struggling to comprehend that what they had believed as normal was in fact monstrous. For the audience, this section is a direct emotional hammer. It forces moral reckoning, prompting reflection on accountability, ideology, and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. Horror is compounded by shame, as viewers witness the psychological impact on men who were soldiers, who had been raised to serve a system that justified such cruelty. The visual narrative does not need commentary. Each image communicates the severity, the guilt, and the moral collapse that accompanies true awareness of wrongdoing. By the end of the sequence, the prisoners' previous pride and confidence were replaced by silence and deep shame. For viewers, the moment resonates not just as history, but as a chilling demonstration of how reality can dismantle belief, and how moral clarity is enforced through undeniable evidence rather than argument. As the war ended and POWs were gradually repatriated to Germany, they carried with them more than memories of defeat. They brought back vivid recollections of life in American camps, stories of abundance that seemed inconceivable compared to their war-torn homeland. Among these memories, one detail stood out vividly: the endless supply of cigarettes. For soldiers accustomed to rationing, scarcity, and strict control over even basic commodities, the simple act of being handed cigarettes freely was both a shock and a revelation.
These cigarettes were more than just tobacco, they became a symbol of what the Americans could produce and share. They represented a society so confident in its strength that it could provide for enemies without hesitation, without fear and without reserve. Prisoners spoke of sharing them, trading them, and even using them to build connections and friendships across camp boundaries. To them, the cigarettes were tangible proof that American prosperity was real, not just propaganda, and that the promises of abundance in this society were concrete and visible in everyday life. For the audience, this section provides a gentle transition from the intensity of D-Day and the horror of concentration camps to a more reflective, human-scale observation. It prompts curiosity about how something as simple as cigarettes could leave a lasting impression on people from a completely different world. The emotional beat is one of hope and transformation. The POWs, once hardened by ideology and war, now returned with a new perspective on human generosity, abundance, and the unexpected ways in which a free society expresses its strength. These memories would later influence not only individual attitudes, but also collective understanding back in Germany, seeding ideas about cooperation, prosperity, and the very concept of a society that could create rather than destroy. It was a subtle but powerful reminder of the legacy left behind by everyday acts of abundance. As the German POWs returned home, the stories of America's endless cigarettes lingered far longer than the war itself. These small luxuries, once dismissed as trivial, had become powerful symbols of an entire society's strength and abundance. To the prisoners, the cigarettes were tangible evidence that a nation could maintain its production, provide for its people, and extend generosity, even to former enemies. They were proof of a democracy's resilience, its ability to combine efficiency with compassion. In letters, diaries, and conversations with fellow soldiers and civilians, POWs recounted how the simple freedom to receive, trade, and enjoy cigarettes reflected the larger principles at play in American society. The abundance they witnessed challenged everything they had been taught under Nazi ideology. It revealed a system where prosperity did not rely on coercion or fear, but on cooperation, innovation, and respect for human dignity. These lessons, small as they seemed at the time, shaped how returning soldiers viewed the world. They recognized that a society built on freedom and productivity could achieve more than conquest or force ever could. For the audience, this section provides emotional closure while reinforcing the broader theme that acts of generosity, even in something as simple as distributing cigarettes, can leave lasting impressions and influence culture. The POWs' experiences became part of the collective memory, helping to seed ideas about rebuilding post-war Germany, with principles of cooperation, efficiency, and democracy. The emotional beat moves toward redemption and uplift, showing that transformation can occur not only on battlefields, but through acts of everyday abundance. By witnessing the Americans' capacity to create, share, and maintain order amidst wartime chaos, the POWs returned not just with cigarettes in hand, but with lessons about humanity, civility, and the quiet power of a society that nurtures its people while showing respect to its adversaries.